Lift your head like me. You got to wear your corner with dignity. How it falls out. Luck is beautiful. I said, sing it along. Luck is beautiful. Say, I'm black and brown. It's my time that we get rid of that old slave mentality. La, 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 la. La, 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 la.
Food plenty in the market. So till GMC don't get. Money not ever buy because you're poor like me. You're black like me. And poverty is your legacy. Last election was 64. Since then was selection. That's all about corruption. Poor like me. You're black like me. And poverty is your legacy. Yet we have democracy and can't do nothing. We have neither the power nor capacity. Code of Conduct Act, start cut down corruption tree, Liverpool, Brabagap, libel scandal, play clean in court, mirror in court, UC in jail, can't get so big. So, Holy man, Buck man, Black man, Chinese man, bury the act, renounce starvation, denounce corruption, announce revolution. Cause you're poor like me, you're black like me, and poverty is your legacy.
Continually exporting spirit of direct foreign fundamentally.
Then was selection, that's all about corruption. Poor like me, you're black like me, and poverty is your legacy. Yet we have democracy and can't do nothing. We have neither the power nor capacity. Code of Conduct Act, start cut down corruption tree, Liverpool, Brabagap, libel scandal, play clean in court, mirror in court, UC in jail, can't get so big. So, Holy man, Buck man, Black man, Chinese man, bury the act, renounce starvation, denounce corruption, announce revolution. Cause you're poor like me, you're black like me, and poverty is your legacy.
Well, good evening. Welcome to Politics 101. Tonight, a special edition. Thinking strategically with IDPADA-G. I'd like to welcome all of you to the program. We came in tonight going down memory lane, the voice there of Ras Michael June, the late Ras Michael June. In my estimation, one of the greatest artists of his generation, doing You're Poor Like Me, you're black like me, and poverty is your legacy. That was way back in 1976 at the Emancipation celebrations in Buxton. We are coming up to Emancipation 47 years ago. Ras Michael June, you're poor like me, you're black like me, and the poverty is your legacy. Prophetic, we are still dealing with those structural impediments to African development in Guyana. Not only in Guyana, wherever African people find themselves in the diaspora, one of the holdovers from the slave period, the way in which the society evolved. And last week when IDPADA-G was here, Professor Thomas Gittins, Theo Gittins, walked us through that history and showed how those that structural evolution of the society militated against real development and empowerment of African Guyanese. And IDPADA-G is back here tonight again. Professor Gittins is here, and they're going to walk us through the strategic objectives. The strategic objectives. There are 6 of them, and they're going to walk us through those strategic objectives. Good evening and welcome to all of you. Those of you who are joining us from Guyana, from the wider Caribbean, our wider Caribbean, tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about the free movement of labor in CARICOM, slated to come on stream next year. As it stands, only certain categories of labor are able to move freely within the CARICOM region. Next year, from next year, all categories of labor would be able to move freely. What does that mean for migration? What does that mean for those of you who are already migrated? What does that mean for Guyana, which on paper, and certainly more than on paper, is the fastest developing country, the fastest growth rate in the CARICOM region? What does that wealth mean for the movement of labor? We're going to discuss that tomorrow night. We're going to have Professor Clive Thomas, to lead off that discussion. He himself is one of the pioneering scholar of the regional integration movement. And so he will be here tomorrow night to talk about the implications for Guyana and the rest of the Caribbean with the coming on stream of free movement of all categories of labor across our Caribbean. We have grappled with regional integration going back to the Federation, 1958, 1962. We have had our ups and our downs. This year we celebrate 50 years of functional cooperation under CARICOM. We have survived. We have survived. The regional integration movement has survived. And some of us, people of my generation, and we're going to have Vincent Alexander on tonight, Professor Gittins on. People of our generation, we grew up with CARICOM. We are really CARICOM babies. Our education was a Caribbean education. We, perhaps the first generation to benefit from a Caribbean education. And it made a big difference in terms of our own world outlook and so forth. And so we grew up with CARICOM. And I have remarked on programs that I've been across the Caribbean that I cannot conceive of my thought process, my own evolution, politically, educationally, etc., outside of the CARICOM framework, whether it's regional integration through cricket or through music or through athletics or through politics or through the academy. We are really CARICOM people. We are CARICOM people. Whatever ups and downs. Yes, there have been insularity. Yes, there have been the times when Guyanese were treated as outcasts by our sisters and brothers in the Caribbean. But, they say, these things don't last forever. Black Stalin said 1 day for the slave and 1 day for the master, meaning that, things, things come into being and things go out of being. Today, Guyana is on the cusp of leading our region to that promised land. If that promised land means getting rid of poverty, which is, for me and for a lot of us, the primary obstacle to throwing off the yoke of plantationhood. And we have a chance to do that in Guyana. We have a chance to do that in our Caribbean, thanks to this windfall that we are getting from oil. Now, we can have all the debate about whether we should get more, what the contract should look like and all of that. But as I've been saying on this program, the fact of the matter is 65% growth is not joke. It means we're getting money that we never got before. And there are things that we could do that we couldn't do before. And one thing we have to bear in mind, what we signed is a production sharing agreement, which means we are sharing the production, PSA. We did not sign an OSA, an ownership sharing agreement. The ownership of the oil is Guyanese. We are not sharing that. That is what Guyana meant when he said that Guyana is the biggest investor in oil and gas. And they started telling him that he's old-timey, talking about socialism and nationalism and so on. Yes. Who says nationalism is dead because we have oil? The oil belongs to us and we have not signed that away. We may have signed a bad contract, a bad PSA, but we own the oil. And that must count for something. And it is in that context, against that background, that we are going to have our discussion tonight. Because African Guyanese is the only group, the only ethnic group in Guyana that was brought to these shores against its will, and its people went through a particular kind of oppression. All ethnic groups went through oppression, but African Guyanese went through a particular kind of oppression. Slavery. And because of that particular kind of oppression, the African Guyanese place in the Guyanese society is a peculiar place because of that peculiar experience of slavery. And so, therefore, IDPADA-G, in this decade of the people of African descent, a recognition that despite changes that have been made in the post-colonial era, changes in constitutions, the laws, the statutory laws, constitutional laws, despite all of that, African people still experience racism and discrimination wherever they are. Now, me saying so, the United Nations, and they dedicated a decade to that. And IDPADA-G has been doing its work. It has been accumulating information. It has been talking to African people. And they have come up with a strategic plan to break the back of that negative legacy of slavery. It's called the strategic plan. Last week it was introduced to you, and this week we want to get a little bit behind the strategic plan, because the strategic plan has 6 strategic objectives. So we're not just talking. We're not playing the fool. My auntie always tell me that you're going to school not just to read and write, but to make sure that nobody make a fool of you. And that advice, all of us would have gotten that advice at some point. And we didn't send our people to universities and so on. We made sacrifices to send them to university, send us to university. We didn't go there just to read the books and to say how bright we are. We go there so we can learn about the experiences of our people. We can take our people's experiences, refine them, turn them into scholarship, and ultimately, as my auntie would say, so that people would not make a fool of us. And IDPADA-G put out its strategic plan, and a little boy who fancies himself as some big economist decided he's going to try to make the fool of us. But that is not an option. It is not an option. We may be the sons and daughters of the enslaved, but as Martin Carter said, to the world of tomorrow, we turn with our strength. We come from the nigger yard of yesterday, leaping from the oppressor's hate and the scorn of myself. And to the world of tomorrow, we turn with our strength. And it's that world of tomorrow that we're talking about here. And we turn into that world of tomorrow, facing that world of tomorrow. We're helping to shape that world of tomorrow with our strength. And that's what we are about. Share the link. Let them know that we're in class tonight. We're in class tonight. So let me go straight because we got business to do. Let me bring in our guest tonight, Vincent Alexander, Dr. Theo Gittins. Good evening.
Good evening to you, David, and good evening to your audience.
Wonderful. And Vincent Alexander, good evening. I hope I've said nothing to embarrass you guys. After all, Theo, you were my teacher at UT, as I said last week, and you always like to make your teacher proud. So I hope I didn't say anything that would embarrass you. And Vincent, you're my senior. And I hope I haven't said anything in that introduction to embarrass you all. Initial comments. Go ahead.
David, I'm not sure about that seniority. Certainly your colleagues. And we both have to concede that Dr. Gittins is our senior who lectured to us and is partly responsible for our being, as you have been explaining earlier in this program. Last week, we dealt to a very large extent with the background and the methodology in relation to the strategic plan, and with some response to Joel Bagwandin's attempt to do a critique of the strategic plan. I must confess that a serious read of his attempted critique would bring one to the conclusion that he was not doing a critique of the strategic plan, because Bagwandin did not address the content, the objectives of that plan, which will be addressed tonight by one of the crafters of that plan. Bagwandin's response to the plan was a hodgepodge. On one hand, he sought to talk about the methodology, and I think we have dismissed that in our last program. On the other hand, he sought to make statements by virtue of his conclusions about where the party in relation to the decade, not giving sufficient recognition to the content of our strategic plan and how IDPADA-G itself came into existence. IDPADA-G is an offspring, not of an internal discussion, but of an international discussion to which Guyana would have made a contribution. A discussion that sought over time to look at the issue of racism and xenophobia, other discriminatory practices that affected the people of African descent. A discussion which concluded that given the negatives that have persisted based on the xenophobia, based on the racism, and in the case of Guyana, based on slavery, that notwithstanding what would have happened uh, after emancipation and post-independence, that a lot of what became embedded in our institutional structures and our legal framework continued and continues unto this day. And therefore, one cannot argue about equality in the context where disadvantages have been brought forward, so to speak. And so one has to speak about equitable solutions. And there is where the analysis failed, because the analysis failed, even though he didn't look at the strategic plan. What he looked at failed to consider the historical conditions that that are to be addressed, and which our strategic plan seeks to address. In his analysis, he sought to make the point that what is required, and in that sense, he's partially right, was action or is action by states and government. But in the case of Guyana, the government took two actions. The first action the government took is to say to the people of African descent, look, organize yourselves. Organize yourselves. If you don't have a view on this matter, if you don't come to the table in this matter, no one else will do it for you. And that is what President Gwenje, in some regards, was saying to us when he said, organize. The second action that he took, and the government took, was to say, now that you are organized, we'll resource you. We'll resource you. And in resourcing us, it was in fact in pursuit of the 6 objectives which will be discussed. How do you achieve these 6 objectives? Those objectives required actions by different stakeholders. IDPADA-G as a stakeholder in its own right, along with its member organizations as stakeholders, in as much as they are part of IDPADA-G, sought to embark on actions required to deal with the issue. One critical action had to be education. Another critical action had to be empowerment. Not that education is not empowerment, but specific kinds of training, specific kinds of non-formal education that would enhance the state of the people of African defense, of African descent, to confront the problem which they are faced with. But as we developed our strategic plan, as we look back at the United Nations and what they said in the declaration, it was recognized that there's a lot of action to be taken by the state. And therefore, with IDPADA-G having done a strategic plan, IDPADA-G then sought to work to roll out annual work programs in pursuit of the goals, the decade, and the objectives outlined in the strategic plan. Sought to have annual work programs. In that process, we came to the point where we recognized that a critical part of the work to be done should involve the state. And in fact, from the very inception, that recognition was there. So, for example, recognizing that one of the issues we thought had to be addressed was recognition through the lens of Guyanese history and the contribution of the people of African descent to the development of Guyana. We approached the Ministry of Education under the Granger regime and under the Ali regime, saying to them, here is an issue the state needs to address. Issue of the teaching of history in our schools, giving sufficient attention to the role of the people of African descent, not neglecting anyone else, so that we could pursue this question of the recognition of the people of African descent by virtue of their contribution that they would have made and are making to the development of Guyana, by virtue to their very being as people coming out of the bellies of civilization, Africa, recognizing them for who they are, as the decade said should be done, and as the theme of this decade incorporates. Recognition is one of the themes. So we spoke to the Ministry of Education. We also spoke to the Ministry of Local Government. And we said to them that, look, we have been unjustly treated in terms of lands, issues related to the village movement, and therefore we need to address this question of the villages and to build on what came out in the constitutional reform process, which said that villages can request the establishment of local authorities at the village level. So we went to the Ministry of Local Government and we said we want to discuss this matter with you because it's a matter with you, the government. And you, the Ministry of Local Government, specifically would need to address how do we activate, if I'm not mistaken, Article 72, I might be wrong, of the Constitution. It allows for the people of African descent in their villages to institute village councils so that they can pay attention to issues that are peculiar to their villages and to themselves. Issues relating to land, issues relating to production, issues relating to culture, having their own body of people address those issues. So that we recognize the role of the state, and we were, in fact, approaching the state. But there came a time when we said, look, we have to have a more global approach to the state, given what was already articulated in our strategic plan. And so we put together a team that spent significant time, months, preparing a document that we refer to as the advocacy document, with the clear intention to approach the government. And having prepared that document, we wrote to the government and said, let us speak. And one is still to understand why is it, particularly at that moment when they were addressing the government for conversation. Vice President Dr.David sought to pull us down and sought to, I would say, put a wedge between the IDPADA-G and the president, to whom we had written, who had responded, albeit not in writing, that we would have the conversation we were asking for, and who in fact responded as he was asked on 3 occasions, positively saying, we'll have that conversation. That conversation was about our advocacy in relation to the objectives, our advocacy in relation to education, our advocacy in relation to employment, our advocacy in relation to equity, our advocacy in relation to expiation, our advocacy in relation to the youth, the element that we added to our plan. That element was not specified by the United Nations. We added the youth. And so we ended up with 6 areas of advocacy which required state action. So we were approaching the state to have them take those actions in their own right or in collaboration with us, people of African descent, or even in collaboration with a wider international community. Lo and behold, here we are today, bringing to the attention of this audience what that plan entailed, emphasizing what the state would have been required to do, rather than being able to report on what the state has embarked on and what the state is in fact doing. One of the things that Bagwandin said is that the state has an obligation to report to the United Nations. Fortunately, our state has not reported to the United Nations. And on the one recent occasion, when they attended the second session of the permanent forum, they did not report. They sought to castigate IDPADA-G, who had been reporting for reporting, but they did not. Suffice to say that we recognize that role, and therefore, under the previous government, on more than one occasion, we interacted with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a specific purpose of providing them with information so that they could have reported, but also for the purpose of saying to them that as the agency responsible for reporting, we're looking to them for an outreach beyond their ministry to other ministries, as we were recently seeking to do with President Ali, so that the state government could be responsive to the goals of the decade. And so tonight, here we are, bringing to the public detailed information, deconstructed our strategic plan, so they would understand what is it we were in pursuit of, what is it the government has struck down by virtue of the actions that they have taken. They have struck down a movement that they supposedly committed to when they, in 2013, they signed on to the declaration. They still have an opportunity, albeit late, to engage and to pursue goals of the decade. Bearing in mind that for all intents and purposes, it has been essayed that it's likely to be another decade. People of Africa, hopefully, we'll be able to use that other decade to double up to what should have been done in this decade, what can be done in that.
Vincent Alexander, chairman of IDPADA-G, giving us an introduction, an overview. Vincent would have to go. We're going to be joined later on by the CEO of IDPADA-G, but in the meantime, we're going to bring in Professor Gittins to walk us through and explain the 6 objectives, strategic objective. The first one, Professor Gittins, strategic objective 1 is to promote economic advancement and empowerment, economic agency and self-confidence, expand access to business and entrepreneurial training, and access to investment capital, enhance capital accumulation and wealth, and assets creation, organize African Guyanese entrepreneurs, construction, trades, and service providers in cooperative networks, rebuild and strengthen African Guyanese businesses, and a producer organization, and ensure a sustainable socio-economic future for the African Guyanese collective. Professor Gittins, over to you.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you, Vincent, for that overview, that introduction to what the plan, the strategic plan, is intended to achieve. And thanks again to our audience out there for being with us this evening. So, David, you've read the first strategic objective, which deals with economic issues. In fact, the presentation in the plan underlines or bolds the words economic agency. And that concept of economic agency speaks to people being able to, in many ways, create their own economic space and to be able to utilize that space for their own self-improvement and advancement. But recognizes also that agency has to be facilitated. And as Vincent mentioned earlier on, African Guyanese come from a peculiar history of enslavement of our ancestors, and thereafter the structures, legal, institutional, policy, and other structures that have been put in place that have in many ways retarded our ability to participate in equal measure in the economic sphere and other spheres. But we're talking about economic strategic objective in this instance. Now, coming out of the strategic objectives, you have what we call the outcomes. And David, I know you've asked me to, or asked us to be at the same time to do a bit of teaching in this process. You have your objectives, and then you outline what the outcomes, what's the change you want to achieve. And in the context of strategic objective 1, we have a number of outcomes, and then the outputs that will be achieved, that in fact we have to actualize to achieve those outcomes. The first outcome deals with the enabling financial, fiscal, regulatory, and operational environment for nurturing and sustainability of African Guyanese entrepreneurs and businesses. By that, we mean how it is that the economic space is organized in terms of taxation, in terms of regulations, in terms of operational aspects. For example, how it is that you will then be able to bid for contracts or participate in development activities, etc. And all of this leading to nurturing and develop and sustaining African Guyanese entrepreneurs and businesses. And under that outcome, we have a number of outputs. First output deals with African Guyanese businesses, entrepreneurs, and manufacturers afforded access to adequate and affordable financing. As I mentioned last week, and I'll mention again, in preparing the strategic plan, we first engaged in an analysis of the historical and other forces that have shaped the condition and situation of African Guyanese historically and into today. And then we had a series of regional consultations or meetings within the communities. And then we had also meetings with African Guyanese organizations and policymakers, etc. And out of those meetings, etc., came the clear indication that they felt that financing was a very critical matter for African Guyanese entrepreneurs and manufacturers and business people in general. The lack of access to, or the inadequate access to financing, etc. That had a lot to do with the structure of the banking system as it operates today, what the requirements are for loans, etc., for accessing loans, etc. And also the absence in many ways of financing institutions that may be put in place by the state, by the government. Financing windows, as they called, that will then allow people to access financing at what are called concessionary rates. Now, many of us who are old enough to recognize, would remember the institutions that were put in place some decades ago, such as the Mortgage Finance Bank, the Guyana Agricultural Industrial Bank, the National Cooperative Bank, and institutions which at that time were intended to provide access to financing at concessionary rates to all Guyanese based on their application to and the satisfaction and satisfying the requirements of those institutions. Unfortunately, many of those do not exist at this point in time. So the challenge that was identified in the lead up to the preparation of the strategic plan is one dealing with financing, and so there's an output that deals with that with a number of activities. The example, advocate for opening of financing windows in commercial banks accessible by African Guyanese, establishment or re-establishment of financing windows to agriculture, industrial banks, and a host of activities of that nature, which I wouldn't go into here. But these are the things that the people suggested that would be needed in order to be able to address that question of access to financing for business people, producers, etc. The second output.
Sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
You feel free to interrupt if you need to. Yeah. The second output deals with the question of our African Guyanese contractors and service providers benefiting from a revised fiscal and regulatory framework or regime governing access to central government contracts and ensuring equal access and a level playing field. Again, this was a concern raised in many of the consultations, that because of the requirements for bidding for contracts and for being able to be awarded contracts, national insurance requirements, taxation requirements, etc., those kinds of, and sometimes they were too onerous for our business community. And this not only applies to African Guyanese, but other ethnic groups, frankly speaking. It was felt that there needed to be a revision in those requirements, making them more attainable by especially those who have historically not been able to meet those requirements, and thereby ensuring equal access and a level playing field. And one of the critical suggestions made, and this is one that I'm sure you've heard about, is for revision, for example, of the applicable legislation on the central and ministerial tender boards. Another one dealt with the application of the legal provision of 20% of government contracts accessible to small-scale contractors and service providers. Now that's a very critical one, because it is there in our financial rules and regulations as an effort or as an attempt to allow at least a small portion, 20%, 1/5, of all government contracts, etc., being accessible to or being reserved for small-scale contractors and service providers. That is something that the small producer, small entrepreneur has been asking for the longest while. It has not happened because apparently the regulations to give effect to that through the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Trade and other ministries, those regulations have not been put in place. So that was a second critical output under this rubric of strengthening access to business and other opportunities. The second outcome, and each objective has a number of outcomes that are set on outputs. The second outcome dealt with the issue of capacity building among our African Guyanese entrepreneurs, contractors, and service providers in the regions and in areas of business planning, financial and operational management, and so on. In other words, the skills that business people need to actually manage their business properly and efficiently. And that's an outcome. Again, people in the consultations felt that they needed that kind of training, that kind of capacity building, as you call it, among our producers, whether it be producers of manufacturing, small-scale manufacturing, or whether it be producers in agriculture, etc. They needed to be able to manage their business. And that included not only being able to sell whatever product it is, but being able, in fact, to organize themselves at the accounting level, to be able to see how it is their business is progressing and so on. So again, a number of outputs there on that business capacity building. The outcomes of capacity building among African Guyanese entrepreneurs. And one output there was the development of appropriate training packages and delivery of training programs in each region for contractors and service providers. Packages dealing, for example, with areas of business planning, financial management, packages dealing with negotiating with training institutions, short courses for entrance into businesses and the business environment and so on. In other words, giving them the basic tools, if they lack those tools, to be able to participate in the business of business, whether it be agribusiness or manufacturing or what have you. Another output, still under the question of access to financing, etc., was organizing business and organizing structures. Sorry, I'm going to grow. Enhance business and organization structures for collective strengthening, networking, information sharing, etc. This is where the cooperative element comes in. It is recognized that because they're small and because they, in many senses, needed to be better organized to compete in what is already a very competitive business environment out there, there was need to organize our African businesses and business persons. And this called for the promotion and establishment of African Guyanese business organizations and associations, such as an African Business Roundtable. Very critical, because that's the way in which you come together as people of African descent with common needs, with who are experiencing common challenges in the marketplace. You come together and you're able in that way to strengthen yourselves through unity of action. So establishing a business umbrella, African Guyanese umbrella business organizations. Another one was promoting and supporting establishment of business cooperatives, bringing together business African Guyanese entrepreneurs, contractors, service providers, etc., for joint bidding for contracts, etc. And because we are starting off at a disadvantage, it's important that we pool our resources in that regard. And here we're talking about business cooperatives for bidding for contracts, etc. Another area in which this felt is needed for cooperative action was supporting the establishment of pools of contractors, African Guyanese contractors. And the business, it was called business incubators for startups, etc., etc. Equipment pooling, or persons involved in, for example, civil works, who may not have access to all the capital needed to get equipment, but at least through a cooperative pool of equipment, be able to get what they need to undertake civil works, etc., and contracts of that nature. So that was a very critical part of it, where we're looking at, again, capacity building of our African Guyanese entrepreneurs, producers, agriculturists, etc., for better participation, for improved participation in the marketplace, and to be better able to take advantage of what opportunities there are in that marketplace. Now, we also have an outcome now, and I'm coming to that, still under the economy, that deals with our farmers. And I know, David, I'm taking a lot of time here.
No, you go ahead. You take your time.
But I think
we don't finish tonight, we come back and finish another night.
All right.
Take your time.
Excellent. All right. Now, this outcome deals with building capacity among African Guyanese farmers, agro-processors, livestock producers, etc., in agricultural techniques, livestock and poultry rearing, processing, packaging, marketing, and financial management. A whole slew of, as it were, skills needed, capacity building needed for our agricultural producers. Now, Vincent mentioned the villages a moment ago in his presentation. And this particular outcome is put there with a view to strengthening the village economy, as we call it. Time passed, and this is going back to the days of the immediate aftermath of the end of slavery. As I think you have explained, David, elsewhere, there was the village movement where the former slaves, enslaved, I should say, who now worked during the period of apprenticeship, saved their money, pooled those resources, and bought villages. Buxton and Victoria and Mocha and other villages along the East Coast and up these banks were bought by these formerly enslaved for huge amounts of money. And that was the beginning of the village movement. Unfortunately, that village movement was stymied, if not sabotaged, in a number of ways. And I know that history is reasonably well known, so I wouldn't go into it here. But the fact is, it was sabotaged in many ways. And our villages have not continued to be, or have not developed to be, the kind of productive enterprises that they were meant to be and that they can be. And that is where we talk about strengthening our village economy. And the strategic plan deals a lot with that under the economy strategic objective. And that's what we're dealing with now. And so we're returning to the plan, just to keep myself on track. This particular outcome deals with capacities, building capacities among African and Guyanese farmers, agro-processors, etc. The output here is appropriate trading packages and trading events delivered in agro-processing and the whole range of skills and capacities they need to be better able to perform in that field. It also deals with, and I'll come to that in a moment, with the school system. The Ministry of Education, as you know, back in the day, you used to have your school farms. These were that's the incubus in a way for development of our small budding farmers, where you have the school farms. It also deals with the Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Regional Development, strengthening delivery of extension services, because that's another way in which our farming community is given the kind of capacity they need, the skills they need. The extension services, as we all know, are those officers who, in time gone by, I presume they're still there, but at least they go into farming communities and help the farmers to develop their techniques, to improve their techniques, etc., including farming techniques, but marketing and skills of that nature. So again, the Ministry of Agriculture and Regional Development and the regional level will have a role to play in that regard in helping our farming communities to actually develop the skills. The next output under that business of strengthening of our farmers and of our producers was enhancing their organizational structure and operational structure for collective and cooperative marketing, production, marketing, quality management, etc. Again, people coming together in a collaborative manner, benefiting in a structure which in fact is designed to meet the communities and through appropriate organizational and operational structures, allowing them or enabling them, I should say, to improve their production, their marketing, quality management, etc., so to meet the needs of the market. One of the constant complaints we hear, I should say, is that at a certain level, our producers do not produce quality goods, or the agricultural products are not properly handled, and so there is a higher rate of spoilage and this use of that. And those are challenges, I think, recognized as such that in fact our producers have. The answer is to strengthen the capacity to manage those kinds of challenges and in fact to overcome them. And so we talk under that particular output of promoting and supporting establishment of African Guyanese umbrella farmer organizations. We talk about supporting the establishment of farmers and producers cooperatives. Same way we talked about doing that in business among the entrepreneurs. We talk about farmers cooperatives also. We talk here about equipment pools for farmers who may need, for example, during the planting season, you may need to have access to tractors, etc., to be able to I hope you hear me, yes. To be able to till the land, etc. And you can then do that in a cooperative fashion where you do a number of farmers in the area at the same time. And so you have these kinds of as it were, interventions. Most often, interventions that are put in place by the state or the government, whether it be the central government or the regional level. But the intention here is to help our farmers and our producers in general to be able to improve their skills. So in a sense, that covers and I've not gone into all the activities, David, on each of the outcomes and outputs, because I figured that it will take too long, but that covers the kinds of outcomes we want to achieve, that is results you want to achieve in the area of economy. We develop our African Guyanese entrepreneurs and producers and business persons. We also develop our African Guyanese producers in the agricultural sector, farmers in the villages, etc., to then be able to develop a robust community that is able to provide for themselves, to add value to national output, and to, of course, to uplift the situation of African Guyanese in general and to. So that's the objective of, as it were, of strategic objective 1, divided into a number of sub-objectives, outputs, outcomes, and outputs. So if you want me to pause there, if any questions, I can do so.
Yes, and I want you to stay. I want you to stay there, and Miss Sampson, who is backstage, please prepare to come in, because what I want you all to talk about now, because we're going to stay with this first objective tonight. Sometimes, it's trial and error, and it means that we'll have to come back in subsequent sessions to deal with the other objectives. But here, I want you to talk about the importance of this first objective. Because remember, the premise of our discourse and our intervention, our advocacy, is that the problems and challenges that are faced by African Guyanese are structural. And as we listen to you, you are arguing that it takes structural intervention at the level of the institutions to correct that problem. I think that's very instructive. So I want you to talk about how important this first objective is to the other objectives which we are going to discuss in subsequent programs. Why is this objective, number 1, such a pivotal and central objective?
Excellent. David, you've hit the nail in the head, and indeed, and one doesn't have to be a Marxist to say it, but the material conditions of existence are critical for any community, any people. And to the extent that you address those material conditions, you also address the questions of production and the ability to earn a livelihood, the ability to grow, to prosper, and in fact, to play their rightful role and to reap their rightful rewards from what society has to offer. So in that sense, the strategic objective 1 that speaks about the economy seeks, first of all, to recognize, and this comes out of the consultations and the meetings I've had with various groups, to recognize that structurally African Guyanese, whether through slavery and the post-slavery period, and certainly through all of the challenges the African Guyanese faced in the, as I mentioned earlier on, the sabotaging of the village movement, the fact that other groups were privileged over them in terms of commerce, etc. The issue here is, and the importance of the economy is that African Guyanese have to be able to regain, one might say, but certainly to attain a position at the economic level which allows us as an integral part of the Guyanese society to flourish and to be able to make our contributions and to be able to sustain ourselves into future generations. So it's very critical.
Yes, go ahead, finish.
It's very critical that we reestablish, and it was there once. I mean, let's not forget the village movement when it in the immediate post-emancipation period was indicated a very strong organizational ethos and a collective and cooperative ethos among African Guyanese. In some ways, in many ways, we seem to have lost that, or that seems to have diminished over the decades. It's important to regain that and to regain our ability to be able to participate in a marketplace, in the market of production, market of sales, etc., but to participate in the marketplace on equal footing like anyone else or any other grouping. And that's the importance of this particular objective that speaks about improving the economic situation of African Guyanese. We recognize that access to capital or financing is critical. We recognize that access to skills is also, or availability of skills in production and marketing is critical. We have to improve those. We recognize that the ability to pool resources and thereby through cooperative actions amongst ourselves is critical in building and lifting everyone, lifting all boats, shall we say. So those are some of the underpinnings of that particular strategic objective. Now, on the other question you asked, David, and how this supports or interacts with the other objectives, I think two things can be said here. Yes, it's important for us to have a solid economic footing, so to speak, or economic role in the economy, a sound, solid role in the economy, in the production sphere, to support other aspects, whether it be culture, whether it be sports, whether it be the arts, literature, etc., and the other elements of society. But at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that while the economy is important, the others are just as important. Education is clearly important in terms of building the capacity, starting with the generations that are entering the school system and those going through the secondary system and the university and professional level training. Education is critical. Employment in terms of employability as well as work ethic, etc., again, very critical. Not everyone will be a producer. Not everyone will be an agriculturalist. Others, there's some who will work in various other professions and various other positions in society. And those persons also have to be prepared to play their role in the economy, as it were, and in the and as productive members of society. So, in that sense, the economy is both, in a sense, a foundation, but it also is an accompaniment to the other elements of the other strategic objectives that we have in the plan. Equality, equity are important because those, and we'll come to that perhaps at some other session. Equality and equity speak to how the society treats others, treats African Guyanese vis-a-vis others. And the plan, and not the plan itself, but certainly the consultations brought out some disturbing perceptions and feelings among people that the legal system, for example, was not did not apply in an equitable way in terms of the various groups and ethnic groups, etc. The youth, the Black youth, African Guyanese youth, were seen as being particularly at the mercy of the legal system, and so on. These are real perceptions in society, and we have to listen to them. But that said, those are not reducible to the economy itself, although to some extent they're linkages. But what it is that we have then to address the legal system, the system of justice, the access to justice. We have to address the question of what happens in our prisons and with people who are incarcerated and so on. And all of those need to be addressed in their own right. So I hope that answers the question you asked, David.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The whole question of linkages are so important. Those of us who have been trained in Marxist economics know, as you intimated, the foundation of the economy. But we're not talking about primacy. We're talking about linkages, the linkage of the economy to the justice system, the linkage of the economy to the education system, the linkage of the economy to the healthcare system, the linkage of the economy to a sense of identity, because people reproduce themselves, as we would say in the Marxist literature. Let's welcome Sister Olive Sampson, who is the CEO of IDPADA-G. Olive, I'll pose the same question to you. You have heard Professor Gittins go through the objective one of building economic capacity, righting some economic wrongs and so forth. And then I pose the question as to why this objective is important. Over to you.
First of all, thank you, David, for inviting me to be on the program tonight. And Theo, saying hello to you and good evening to your guests. For IDPADA-G, this is a really golden opportunity to share information about our strategic plan. So, because people have heard about IDPADA-G over the last several months, but here we are speaking to what our vision, what was it that IDPADA-G was seeking to do over the last 4.5 years. And we really are grateful for the leadership of Theo Gittins and his team in putting together this strategic plan, and all that people across the country did to contribute to it, because it's a reflection of all of those meetings that he held, 25 communities and countless 17 other groups, etc. So it was sound in its approach. Why is economic the strategic objective number one, which deals with the economy, why is that central? Because it is the basis of our functioning in society. One has to have the wherewithal to function and to seek an education, put food on the table, even support one's church. You know, I was looking at the attendance, church attendance, and the state of so many of our older churches. And I know I'm sounding like I'm digressing, but the point is that when our economic base is not strong, our civil society institutions, our churches and others also fail. Our community becomes less strong. And so the whole issue of the economy being central is I think what we really needed to focus on, and we did. And David, if you don't mind, I'd like to take this opportunity just to talk a little bit about some of the things that we did accomplish under the whole question of economy.
Yes.
Because under that, output number 1.1.1, and people can go to our website and look for the strategic plan. It's there with the implementation plan. So output number 1.1.1 says African Guyanese businesses, entrepreneurs, and manufacturers afforded access to adequate and affordable financing. And to accomplish that, it suggests one of the activities it calls for is establish the African Guyanese Credit Union on a sound financial footing, grow its capital base, and ensure affordable and sustainable financial resources for African Guyanese borrowers. Well, we did do that. We have established the IDPADA-G Credit Union. It was established in June 2020. In the midst of COVID, we did not allow COVID to slow our progress. We kept on working. And so we did launch that credit union. We've gone around the country informing people about it. It has over 1,200 persons who have signed up for the credit union. Many of them are full members already. Others are working towards making sure they have the full amount that is required for membership. It's only $5,000, but it gives an opportunity for persons who have found it very difficult to benefit from the commercial banks in order to do that. And so people have joined the credit union. Some people have been in it long enough to have been able to borrow, but there are regular contributors. And I urge the listening audience to consider membership in the IDPADA-G Credit Union. I want to harken back, as I say that, to the village movement and the lesson taught. The lesson taught is about how one can accomplish something as a group, how a group can pool its resources and make an enormous step forward. David and Theo, you both know that the village movement, the purchase of abandoned plantations, the number of them that were purchased was a statement of the power of the African, the formerly enslaved, the emancipated African. Really came off like a foot race, came out of the blocks with a burst. The largest acquisition of real estate in all of Guyana's history was at that point. Prior to their establishment of villages on those plantations, there were no villages in Guyana. African Guyanese created the villages that Guyana has now built upon. And so given that lesson, which is so empowering, coming out of the village movement, the purchase of abandoned plantations cooperatively, some of them were proprietorships, but there was a cooperative movement. We know that the cooperative credit union has great benefit. And so that is something that we have already accomplished. And our credit union operates from our offices on North Road in Georgetown. Again, I invite anyone to encourage people to join, because in pooling our resources, we benefit our community. We've also worked, one of the things that Theo mentioned earlier was the whole question of cooperatives with respect to businesses. We worked with a group of vendors who they both walk and sell in front of Stabroek Market, along the pavements on Regent Street and at Border Market. We brought them together and they have formed a co-op so that they can purchase cooperatively. Now, they have submitted all of their paperwork and are waiting for finalization. But the point is, we have gone through all of the work for these vendors to benefit from the cooperative action, because purchasing in bulk, they will be able in turn to sell at a more competitive price and also to make better profits. But these are just two examples of some of the work that IDPADA-G is doing, has done, and will continue to do. We have done a lot of capacity building for business persons. Theo also mentioned that capacity building is central to what IDPADA-G does. If you were to look at the strategic plan, you would see that there are many activities, but the two that jump right out at you are capacity building and advocacy. The question of advocacy is critical to IDPADA-G and our work. So we do the capacity building for farmers, for small business persons, etc. But we also advocate. Our role is to advocate with government. And Mr. Alexander dealt with that earlier with the efforts that we've been making with respect to this government. We did that with the former government, and we would like to continue that work with the current administration. So those are just a couple of things I'd like to mention with respect to working with business. We had our door open to persons to come in. Small business persons came in on a regular basis for assistance with business plans and assistance with enrolling for SBB, the registration, assistance in many ways. We established not only those one-on-one assistance programs, but also training programs where we arranged training programs for business persons to learn to really improve their business skills, whether it was record keeping, developing their business plans, packaging for loan applications, a range of services to small business persons, both individually and through classes. And then one other thing, and then I'll stop, that Theo mentioned was this question of contractors, ensuring that the African Guyanese business community, small contractors, would improve their performance with respect to bidding. We have offered a training program for small contractors. We've had 4 iterations of this training program, and it runs for roughly 5 weeks. It's thorough. They met twice a week and for 2.5 hours, and then some on one-on-one time, so that they could become successful in the process of bidding. It is one of the things that we're working on, is trying to gather more information from those graduates of the training program on their success rates. But certainly they came from, there was online, usually we offer it online, so that we can reach persons outside of Region 4. So we had representation from Regions 3, 4, 5, and 10 on those training programs, and a few from 6 and 2. But because of internet spottiness, those folks have had some difficulty. So I'd just like to leave that there for the moment.
Thank you, Sister Olive, for that intervention, especially what IDPADA-G has done. Because although you are trying to get the government at the level of the institutions to aid this process of repair, it is instructive that you are doing things on your own. You are doing things on your own. Now, I think there's a consensus that this cannot be achieved just by IDPADA-G and African organizations. The state has to intervene. But what it shows is that IDPADA-G is not walking on one leg. Sister Olive, there are requests for information, phone number, website, and all of that. While you're getting that together, let me just bring Theo in for his closing remarks, and with the understanding that we have only gotten through one objective tonight. We have 5 objectives to go. So it looks as though we're going to be here for 5 other parts, which is good because we are in the emancipation season. And what a time to be giving our people this kind of information. Some people here did not know of the initiatives taken by IDPADA-G. So one of the outcomes is, of course, educating, but also informational. So while you are gathering that information together, Theo, your closing reflections.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thanks, Olive, for coming in and talking about what IDPADA-G has been doing on the ground and in practical terms. It's clearly important that we recognize that a lot of this work is going to be very time-consuming. It's going to be work that, in fact, reaches various audiences at different times, but it's work that has to be done. A strategic plan is in a sense, a collection of actions and outputs and activities, but it's in moving along and implementing these that the critical changes will happen. And I'm happy that Olive was able to bring out to us this evening some of the things that are happening on the ground, that have been happening on the ground already, with the work with entrepreneurs, with the work with youth, with the work with the persons who are selling, the vendors, etc. That's critical in terms of moving the plan and giving the plan life. A plan will not live unless you have the activities that are there and the outputs that are there to be achieved, unless those things are addressed in a systematic and, in some ways, an aggressive way. It takes resources, it takes people, but with people, resources, and with commitment, it can be done. So I'll close this part of my presentation by saying that in all of this, the commitment of those who have the responsibility to lead and shepherd this process, as well as the commitment of those who are the intended beneficiaries of this process, both have to display the commitment and the engagement that are needed in order to make things happen and to become successful. So thank you, David, for having me again this week. I'll close at this point. I look forward to our next session.
Thank you very much. The next session, we're going to get into the objective number 2 and maybe number 3, but certainly number 2. We will see how it goes, so you can prepare for 2 or 3, 2 and 3. Indeed. Next week. We'll see how it goes. Thank you very much, Professor. Sister Olive, the information that they've been asking for.
Sure. Persons interested in finding out more about the credit union or anything about IDPADA-G can call 223-8852. That is 592-223-8852. Our credit union also has a Facebook page, so IDPADA-G Credit Union on Facebook. IDPADA-G Credit Union on Facebook. We also, our website, we are working on it, but I'll still give you the information. IDPADA, that's IDPADA-G.gy. So that's the usual www. etc. for IDPADA-G's website. And finally, for information, please feel free to email us at info@idpada-g.gy. That's IDPADA, IDPADA-G.gy. info@idpada-g.gy for any questions that you might have.
And we seem to have some work here also for IDPADA-G. People are asking for reading materials. They're asking for books and articles that have to do with the village movement in particular. So
okay. On our website, and going to our website, there's a section on history, and it has recommendations on books that persons might want to acquire. Or to have it go to the library. There are books on African history, particularly the village movement, at the library. But please do check out our website And we do have up there, and I'm going to double check tonight to be sure that we have up there a list. We had a researcher put together an entire list of all of the villages that were purchased by our ancestors so that we do not forget. We do not forget. And one project we would like to work on is to have a special sign put in front of each one of those villages with information about the purchasers and when those villages, when those plantations were purchased and then became, of course, villages. So thank you so much for the opportunity, David.
And thank you very much for.
And if I mention, David, if I might,
yes, go ahead, Tom.
On the business of on the question of reading sources and information sources, etc., the strategic plan has on Annex 4 a full bibliography of sources consulted for the literature review. As you know, that was very critical in terms of establishing the historical and the other forces that, in fact, have shaped African Guyanese and have determined where we are, etc. And there's a full bibliography there, countless pieces that are available, I think, fairly easily on the internet, etc. So the bibliography, or the sources, on Annex 4 of the strategic plan is also a source to consult.
Thank you all very much. Patricia, the website is IDPADA-G.gy. That is IDPADA.g.
IDPADA-G.gy.
IDPADA-G.gy. I hope you get it. Yes. And I am going to try to see if I can put together a list of readings too. I know there is a book by UC Guyana in which I did an interview with him on the village movement that is very, 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 very informative. So we're going to try to get as much resources. But my God, you all make teachers feel good, because this is what the Theo will tell you, and Olive, I'm sure at some point, because we all were teachers at some point, would tell you that when you get this kind of feedback and this kind of questions from your students, you know that you're doing your work. Sister Olive, thank you. Brother Theo, thank you, and I'll see you guys next week.
Yes, thank you so much, David.
Good night, all.
And thank you all for coming through as usual. I'm so proud of us. I'm so proud of us that we are able to sit down and to go through this kind of information, because you all know that one of the things that we are lacking is that we don't know, is that we don't get a chance to engage what we know in this kind of way. Is public education. Public education, and is, for me, one of the most powerful supplement to the formal education system. Thank you all very much. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about free movement of labor throughout the Caribbean, what that means for Guyana, what it means for our Caribbean, what it means for ordinary working people. We'll have esteemed Professor Clive Thomas, and we'll get him to talk a little bit about that estimated $5,000 cash transfer that has just been embraced and adopted by the APNU, announced by opposition leader Aubrey Norton. So I'll see you all tomorrow night. Same time, same place.
If you hear that,